Good afternoon. Happy Friday. We're here at 1:30 instead of our 3:30 time slot, and we're wrapping up our week with Joseph and the law of process. And so as you've come to expect, on Fridays, we change things up a little bit, and rather than going into a more in-depth lesson like we do on Monday through Thursday, Friday is more of an application and a summary of the preceding 4 days. So we've been looking at this law of process, and again, just to remind us, what is the law of process? Simply means that leadership develops daily and not in a day. So to introduce our final study of Joseph and the law of process, let's kind of retrace our steps where we've been this week. We've spent the last 4 days studying about the law of process and how this law impacted Joseph's growth as a leader. We noted how in Joseph's early years, his character flaws and his immaturity prevented his growth as a leader. However, that began to change the day his brother sold him to the Egyptian slave traders. On his 13-year journey from the pit to the palace, Joseph endured many significant trials, which ended up changing his life. Because of these trials, and that's key, because of these trials, he got better rather than bitter. And through his effective leadership, many lives were saved that otherwise would have been lost, including, interestingly, his very brothers who sold him into slavery and began this whole process. Most importantly, he was able to see the hand of God orchestrating everything. So that summarizes our journey with Joseph this week. We've noted how he didn't start off too well because he relished his role and status as the favorite son. And he, rather than using discretion, used indiscretion to freely share his dreams with his brothers who already hated him. And of course, the scripture tells us that after he told them his dreams, they hated him even more. And so it began a journey, though, when he ended up in the pit, but we know he finally ended up in the palace. And what we learned is what happened in between those two things. So some key scriptures, we've already gone over them, but these couple of scriptures really highlight Joseph's journey for us. In Genesis chapter 45, verses 5, and then we'll skip over 6 and go to 7 and 8. This is Joseph speaking now to his brothers after he had just revealed himself and shocked them, no doubt, because they had no idea who he was by this point in time. And so this is when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers who have come to Egypt to buy grain. And he says, "But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Now here's the key line, this very next statement. "So now it was not you who sent me here, but God." What a change of perspective. And it was the trials that did it. Had everything gone smoothly for Joseph that whole time, I don't think he ever would have gotten here. But it was the transformational impact of the trials that he went through that ultimately brought him to realize that he had to rely on God, and that God's hand was superintending everything that he went through. And you just see that journey of progression and how things that he had absolutely no control over ended up putting him at the right place at the right time. He didn't have to manipulate it. He didn't have to try to make it happen, so to speak. He allowed God to do it, and how much better it was for him. And then in Genesis 50, verse 20, very last chapter in Genesis, and many of you are familiar with this passage here. But as for you, and this is again Joseph speaking to his brothers, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. And maybe that word just right there is something for us to remember, that sometimes even when people mean something to harm us in some way, God, because of who he is, can even use those things to bring about a better good in our life. And that's why Romans 8:28 reminds us, all things, not just the good things, but all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. So let's take in everything that we kind of have looked at this week. You should, by now, you kind of know the drill, that these four statements represent the leadership thoughts for the preceding 4 days. So back on Monday, we touched on this issue that it's not the dream of a lifetime, it's the dream that takes a lifetime. And so that simply means that this is a process. It is a journey to grow as an individual, to grow as a leader, to develop to our full potential. It's not something that happens overnight. I know we live in a microwave society and we want stuff and we want it now, but our journey does not work that way. It's a lifetime process, which of course leads us right to the very next point from Tuesday. It takes time to grow as a leader. With Joseph, the pit to the palace was a 13-year journey, and he had to go through an awful lot in order to finally get to where he needed to be. Thirdly, and we kind of wish it wasn't this way, but oftentimes it really is, that it not only takes time to grow as a leader, but it also takes trials. It takes those challenges, some of them unfair, some of them not what we would want or ask for, but it's those very things that God can use to refine us and to make us better as opposed to bitter. And then from yesterday, we took special note that it takes God's help to grow as a leader. So, a special note here that many factors in our development as a person, as an individual, as a leader, are outside of our control. So consider Joseph and his journey. On the left of this next slide, these are some things that Joseph had absolutely no control over. For one, the timing of his life, right? None of us have any say-so over when we're born. We just don't get to choose. Secondly, his birth order. Now, you might wonder, well, why did I put that in there? Well, especially in that culture, if you were the last born, which he was until finally his younger brother came along, but when all this was going on, Joseph was the youngest. And the youngest wasn't exactly the cherished position to be in. So in that case, birth order mattered. So it came into play when his father kind of doted on him. But the next point is even more poignant. And this one might seem even more surprising to you. I mean, on the one hand, you would certainly say, well, duh, of course Joseph couldn't control who his mother was. But in this story, it meant everything. Because as you recall, Joseph's mother was Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob loved the most. And at this point in time, Joseph was the only son of Rachel. All the others were sons of either Leah, Rachel's sister, David's other, or Joseph's other wife, or Leah, or their concubines. So Joseph was Jacob's first son with Rachel. And that directly contributed to why Joseph was the favorite. And all the lavishing that Joseph received happened right there. But Joseph had no control over that, not a bit. He didn't have any control over the trials that he faced. And then finally, he didn't really have any control over the way that God would bless him. Now, those were things that Joseph could not control, but there were other aspects to this journey that he could control. For instance, at some point, he made up his mind to start learning and growing. And that's a choice that all of us have to make. We can either choose to settle where we are and kind of put it in neutral, or we can determine to keep growing, keep investing in our own development. But that's a choice. And then probably the most important thing here is his response to his trials. No control over the trials, a lot of control over the response to them. In fact, it's interesting when we break down the word responsible. We normally think of that as, well, someone who makes wise choices, someone who does what they're supposed to be doing. They're where they're supposed to be. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's how we think of the word responsible. But what if we broke it down just a little bit differently and we said response able? Response able. In other words, able to choose our response. That's really what it means. The ability to choose our response. And so we can have stimulus that we can't control, but response we can. Joseph responded to his trials really magnificently. Next, and we covered this in the last couple of days, Joseph developed a God perspective. In his younger days, everything revolved around him. And to be honest, many of us are like that too. That's what being self-centered is all about, or being egotistical. You know, life revolves around me, and so does everything else. But for Joseph, it became instrumental to where he ended up in terms of his growth and development, and in particular, what he was finally able to do. Not just the position that he held, but the fact that through his leadership, in fact, many, many people were spared who would have perished otherwise. But by this time, he had developed a God perspective, and he knew that God was in charge, and that God was moving, and God was directing and orchestrating everything. And then finally, we looked at this yesterday, what Joseph could control was that he had developed an eternal perspective. In other words, he saw where his life and his service and his ministry fit in the big picture. Because right at the end of his life, he tells his brothers, when he's basically on his deathbed, he says, God is going to continue to prosper you here in Egypt, but this is not where eventually you're supposed to be. And he made them swear that when they eventually got to the promised land, that they took his bones with them. And so Joseph could now see not only God's hand in how things were working, but he could see how his life fit the bigger picture. Which brings us then to our weekly prayer on Friday, as we try to summarize our week in terms of a prayer. And so if you'll just, whether you're there on Zoom or here in the chapel with us, if you just bow your heads for this prayer. Dear God, please put me on the road to greater leadership development. Reveal the dream you have for my life. Place it in my heart and kindle my passion for it. While you help me grow, teach me to embrace the whole development process. Give me patience when I need it and passion when it's appropriate. Teach me to look beyond my life and desires. And when I'm ready, show me the big picture, as you did for Joseph. Amen. So in that prayer, it really it encapsulates this week's lessons. So on Fridays, we really like to suggest some application points. We don't want this journey to just to be about concepts, but what can we do with what we've learned? What are some things that perhaps we can do to live it out? So I want you to think about your leadership development process. Perhaps you would describe yourself as being in the dream discovery phase. In other words, you haven't had that dream like Joseph did or other people have had. You're trying to figure out what it is. And that's okay. Don't despair of that at all, but just keep pursuing and keep discovering. But others, maybe you've already have a sense, a very strong sense, that you know what your dream is, and now you're endeavoring to live it out. Either way, the best thing you can do is determine to grow and to keep running after it. So here are some practical suggestions to assist you in terms of your leadership journey. Pick some books. The one we're looking at now would certainly be a great start, as would the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, upon which this book, the 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day, is based on. And John Maxwell, of course, has many, many other books that would be great books to look at too, but there are many others. So choose some books or some articles to read, put them on your calendar, make an appointment with yourself, or say by June, for instance, I'll have read at least one of these or two of these to put a commitment to it. Number two is personal to me, because next week on Wednesday, I'm going to a leadership conference. So I'm trying to put into practice what I'm sharing with you. And so this Wednesday, I'll be out of the office and down in Cincinnati for a leadership seminar that I'm really looking forward to. There's all kinds of websites, obviously, that you can go to that can help sharpen your skills. One site that I like to go on every now and then is TED Talks, where it's our kind of motivational and equipping kind of discussions that usually a business leader has on any number of different topics. But I highly recommend TED Talks. And then this last one I think can be rather interesting. Maybe there's someone that you can identify to go on this journey with you. There's nothing that says you have to do it alone. Wouldn't it be great to take some other leaders with you and say, hey, let's get together and maybe we'll study this article or whatever it might be, or maybe you're in a work group and you go together with some colleagues and you say, hey, let's get together and process this and see how we can exchange ideas, thoughts, responses, and maybe it'll help us both out. So those are just some very practical suggestions. We could come up with a whole bunch more, but I think that can at least prime the pump. And that's really what we're talking about here, just priming the pump to take what we've looked at and studied Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Friday, we're putting feet and legs to it. So every week we kind of close with this thought before we transition to next week. What one leadership concept, insight, or practice that you've learned this week will you pass on to another leader or someone else in the next few days? Hopefully, you find enough value in this that when on any given day, you might think, wow, so-and-so could really be blessed if they heard this. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about there. We're always wanting to pass things on. We don't need to hoard. The more we give, the better it gets. So we begin on Monday then to transition to week 4. And week 4, we're going to be discussing a brand new law, the law of navigation. I don't know if any of you have been on a boat ride recently or at all, but the law of navigation says anyone can steer the ship but it takes a leader to chart the course, right? Doesn't much matter if someone can hold the steering wheel if they don't know where they're going. And I'm really excited for the biblical leader that we're going to be studying, Nehemiah, another Old Testament saint. Nehemiah's book is one of the great testimonies of leadership. And when you read the story, you'll see why. Nehemiah, I'll quickly run through the passages. Nehemiah 1 through 11, Nehemiah 2, 1 through 20, Nehemiah 4, 1 through 23, and then Nehemiah 6, 15 through 16. So thanks for being with us. And we want to give a shout out to Clint Betts, who I affectionately refer to as my technology lid lifter, and who has graciously put all of these videos on YouTube, and will pass along a brand new code that he gave to me that's even shorter than the first one, so that if you miss any lessons, you can catch up there on YouTube. So God bless you. We're looking forward to seeing you next week, and have a great weekend. Take care.